Oh, baby. All right, boys and girls, are you guys ready for an adventure? because because I wasn't. Before I started the collector, I thought it was going to be like a walk in the park. I was all like, wow, there's less characters in it in boxes and I can do this like that and it's all going to be fine. And it wasn't at all. In fact, it was so much worse than I even imagined. It wasn't actually that bad. I'm just being dramatic, but I did learn a lot. And in this video, I'm going to talk about, what went right, what went wrong, how I solved problems, and how I made new ones. This video structure is also going to be a tad different compared to previous ones. Usually I'd follow like a structure where I talk about like storyboarding and then blocking and then animation and what have you. But I've already kind of talked about a lot of that stuff like at length in previous videos. So this one's going to be a little bit all over the place because I'm going to be focusing on talking about like specific things that I've learned and stuff rather than like trying to outline the whole process. So if you're curious about any of that stuff and you haven't watched the previous videos, then check them out. They got a lot of nice juicy gossip in there. And that's it. Yeah, onto the video. Inspiration? Pretty much everywhere, to be honest. Like music, games, shows, movies, and stuff. I also partake in the wonderful act of like listening to music and then just imagining music videos for them. I make a lot of mental notes about the things that I like in my media, and I just try to include them wherever I can in my own stuff. I'm also fortunate enough mentally to be able to like derive a lot of inspiration from myself, believing that I might someday be this like amazing creator that I can do everything I want to do, but like really well. That keeps me going every now and again. I very much thrive when I give myself specific limitations. So generally when I'm writing something, I tend to follow like a certain criteria. And you can even see this kind of roughly in like all my videos. Like I'll figure out like a core gag or a core idea, confine it with like one or two rules, and then just navigate it and brainstorm around it with like a bunch of what ifs. So for the collector, every sequence has one or two kind of core ideas that follow some rule. And this kind of thing molds the progression for like any video. So as a fun exercise, I'll try to break down the opening sequence with Isabella's announcements. So for the opening, the core idea was Kevin needs to hear the news and become frantic. But the rules were Isabella is the one giving the news and Kevin is nowhere near Isabella. So how do we get him together? Well, for starters, I wanted to use the announcement cutscene, which implies that she's speaking into a PA system. That means we can do shots of her voice echoing across the island. Sweet. But now, how do we make reading text engaging to the viewer? Well, what if we do that with the speech bubble? We could have it kind of just floating across the sky, implying her voice is reaching across the island. And then I'm thinking to myself, what if it was trying to look for Kevin? I always intended for her to specifically call him out, and I thought it'd be funny if at that point, the bubble started hunting him down. So in that case, then it breeds the question of what is Kevin doing? I didn't want to animate him doing anything too difficult, so I just had him lay underneath a tree. But then that ended up snowballing into a bigger problem because then I wanted to do that crawl animation that he did. It ended up being a big can of worms, but the bubble slides up underneath him, he sees it, freaks out, grabs it, throws it. That's the end of that gag. And the grabbing is important because it establishes something that can happen for a later gag. And that's kind of how a sequence evolves in my mind. I take a simple idea, I give it a rule or two, or sometimes none, and then just brainstorm around it. As for an entire short idea, I very much just think of either funny jokes or cool shots or sequences that I'd like to explore, and then just like write a whole short around it. So in the case of The Collector, it stemmed from wanting to do the fish pile and the shark bass gag. But when it came closer to actually like making it, I thought, oh, well, I can't just make an entire short about like these two specific things, so let's expand it a bit. And then that turned into, well, what if we have a sequence for all four aspects of the museum? And then from that, it was like, well, what are four things that I'd like to address? And that then turned into wanting to do a piece about weapon durability, echoing the sea bass frustration, echoing my personal fossil collecting frustration. And I also just love riffing on Red whenever I can, so him never showing up was a given. So writing is all over the place. but the web of ideas eventually like come together into like a nice action list, and then that action list is the script, which what the short as a whole is made from. Creator's block? What's that? I'm amazing! Oh, I can't even say that with a straight face. No, I deal with creative blocks like almost daily. Though my blocks aren't necessarily me struggling with coming up with ideas. I'm one of those folks that'll, hum myself recording for music or write down notes relatively wherever I am. So whenever it comes time to actually like sit down and do work, I can just refer back to the bank and pick an idea to build off of and then roll from there. What I struggle with a lot is starting and continuing a flow. I often run into days where I'm like just not really there. Even this video was a struggle for me to start because like I knew I wanted to talk about stuff, but the notion of just starting it and writing this out and recording it and just like thinking of having to do all this stuff set me back a lot, or at least slowed down the start a lot. So whenever this happens, I try not to push myself too much, but I do also try to follow like the non-zero workday strategy. So if I'm feeling down someday, I'll still open up a project and like attempt to work on it for like half an hour to an hour or so. And if I'm still not feeling it, then I'll just close up shop and then I'll go watch a movie or something. Or if it kicks me into the right gear, then that usually keeps me going for like the rest of the day. But that brings me to my next point, which is I'm also a bit of a rare breed of like workaholic. Like if I'm in a groove, then I'll just keep going like without much pause. And it's weird because some days like I'll be very obviously in a like I don't want to work kind of mood, but I'll just keep going. And every now and then I'll need to like mentally put my foot down and say, okay, buddy, it's time for bed. And that internal dialogue typically goes, man, I've been working all day. I think it's time for bed. And the brain goes, see, I see that. But also, you only have like 3 shots left. So if you finish them tonight, you can put them on the farm, have them render while you sleep, and then they'll be done in the morning. It'll be a good time. Come on, let's just keep this party going. And I'll go, yeah, but it's already 12 a.m. and these 3 shots are gonna take like another like 3-4 hours to do or so. And he goes, yeah, but they'll be done. And I go, no, you're stupid. I'm going to bed. And sometimes I won't win that battle, and I'll go to bed at like 3 a.m. in the morning. So creative blocks for me are either one or the other. Like I either don't want to work at all, or I'm only working, and there's literally no middle ground. Where do I derive motivation from to make these? Like I have these ideas that require like so much self-discipline to achieve, but for some reason I'm so eager to like see them made that I'm willing to like drag myself through the mud to make them. And I don't really know where that comes from, to tell you the truth. There's this feeling about all this, not necessarily making Animal Crossing videos, but like videos and music in general, that I just can't really seem to escape from. If I'm not making stuff, then I'm just like, I don't know. I just can't not. Are these videos fun to make? Well, tell ya. I get to learn a ton about myself, about Blender, about Animal Crossing and music, and all sorts of things because of this pursuit. These videos are just an elaborate excuse to have a reason to learn Blender and film and just generally continue to grow as an all-around artist. But are they work? Also, yeah, a ton. There's so much monotonous grunt work that goes into like every frame of these things that you just have to do. And yeah, aspects of it really suck. If I'm working on a part too long, then I start to get impatient and frustrated with myself because whatever I'm doing just isn't done and over with fast enough. But if you don't do it, it doesn't get made, and then no one gets to see any of it. Like, I guess I'm motivated by reaching an end result and seeing something finally come together, but that doesn't really like work as a device to give to people because it's not universal. Everyone thinks of themselves and their projects differently. So when folks ask me motivation tip or whatnot, I don't really know what to tell them. I'm some freak self-motivating anomalous guy that also can't replicate this mentality with anything else. Ask me to do anything else and I'll kind of grasp it, but never as well as this stuff. But that doesn't stop me from trying. My videos don't necessarily have budgets. There's time budgets for sure, but not really monetary ones. At least ones that I like keep track of. Monetarily speaking, every one of these videos is technically free to produce. Blender's free, Resolve is free. You can acquire the Animal Crossing files, but that's basically all you need. They all just take time to produce. So what I personally spend money on are programs and tools or add-ons that help streamline like release certain things. Like I'm buying things with the intent of using them with future projects, with the current project seeing the immediate benefit of whatever purchased. In the case of the collector, here's a bunch of stuff that I ended up buying to help. We got this Lighting Pro thing to help to speed up lighting. This node preview so that I can quickly see node textures in the shader editor. An ocean modifier and dynamic paint add-on. I'll talk about this later when I talk about water. A 3D motion trail add-on thing. Blender has 3D motion trails, but this just comes with a couple more features. And yeah, they're mostly just Blender add-ons to help me with like lighting, texturing, water, and animating. I could have done everything without them, but having them made me just a little bit faster, and I'll now be able to take this little bit of extra speed with me with every project onward. As for time budgets, I do try to set deadlines so I'm not like working on things for too long, but I'm not super strict about them. If I hit it, awesome. If I don't, that's okay. We'll just set a new one and keep going. But it seems like the longer I work on a video, the less people notice when it actually comes out. Like I get a lot of comments, people telling me like take my time because I know you guys want to see nice videos and I do want to produce nice videos. But the last thing I want is to like have a repeat of Patapons or Feet where I work on them for however long they take and then get seen by almost no one. At least in relation to this number. But I digress. I don't really have tracked budgets per se because I spend money to speed up my future self so that future me can finish a nice looking video as fast as possible. No, I'm not looking into hiring people. I have mixed thoughts about it. Don't ask. Hey guys, welcome to this episode of Episode. I'm your host, a guy wearing pants. Grass bending. The grass intersection was actually something I wasn't initially planning on doing. I'd never done it previously in other videos, and I was like, this one's going to be no different. But then I gave myself this shot, and I said, wow, that's not going to work if I don't do grass. So when it actually came to doing it, this shot wouldn't have worked as well if the grass was just not there or if it didn't move. So when it actually came to the point where I had to put grass into it, I had to take a nice big deep breath and go, okay, how do I do this? So I Google, I YouTube, how do you do grass interaction? And we find generally nothing. Hey, editor Dumple here. In the secondary research of fact checking, I came across this YouTube video that basically shows exactly how to do it, and specifically with the grass setups. I legitimately did not see this at all at any given point during any of my research. It literally never appeared. It was. But yeah, this thing should probably have this is the goods, all right. So then I'm all like, okay, well, grass is hair, so how do people do it with hair? And it's relatively simple, but kind of finicky. You just got to make sure you have enough hair strands. I add more grass with child extrapolations. This just instances like a single strand of hair all over like a face. And if there isn't enough of them, then we get this like weird clumping effect when the grass animates. So just crank it, toggle on hair dynamics because hair is dynamic, and set your other object to as a collider, and that's basically it. And yeah, that was pretty much the grass setup that I did for this shot, as well as this shot, kind of with the settings kind of tuned a little bit more to make the grass shorter and a little bit more reactive. I wanted to add grass or some movement in this shot and in this shot, but it ended up just taking more time and more effort than I thought it would. I just ended up scrapping most of it for most shots. Rigging. What can I even say about rigging? I don't really know rigging, to tell you the truth. It seems like I do, but I actually have no idea how to do any of it, at least in Blender. Like I've done manual rigging before in like Maya, but that's a world that is just not meant for me. So I use Rigify instead. Whoa! What's Rigify, you ask? Well, it's this modular semi-procedural rig generator add-on that comes pre-installed with Blender. Just make sure to activate your preferences because it's there. I use this to generate rigs for pretty much all my characters or tools and creatures and insects and even the scorpion. And it literally saves me like days worth of rigging because it just does almost all of it for me. The rigs it poops out are animator friendly with like IK, FK switching and like bending helpers and like squash and stretch manipulation and like a bunch of other neat little interface toggleable visibility things and like parent switching and stuff. And like it makes rigs, usable rigs, pretty neato. Yeah, I can't stress this enough. Like if you don't know how to rig and you don't necessarily care to learn, this is like a fantastic tool that can get you like up and running like super quickly, and it's modular, so it's capable of generating both simple and relatively complicated rigs. This same add-on was used to rig both like the net and the scorpion, and it's cool. It's pretty. Though I should also stress, if you're more experienced and you need to do like really specific things with rigs, with like blend shaping and like advanced facial controls and whatnot, it might not be the best. But for like 90% of things that you might need to do, at least for me, it gets the job done beautifully. Like beautiful. The reason why I stick with it so much, despite it bringing troubles every now and again, is because A, it's super simple. You can rig almost anything with it. You still need to fine-tune weight painting and stuff, but like that's just one of the aspects of rigging that you kind of have to do anyways. And B, if I need to update a rig later, like let's say I need to change a pivot point of a bone or add or remove bones or what have you, then it makes it super easy because you can just make changes on the meta rig and then just click the update button and the whole rig just updates along and you're in the money. You're literally rolling in the literal currency. With this, rigging isn't much of a challenge. If you want to like see me using it in action, then you can check out some of the live streams. But the face controls for the characters are a little bit of a different story because those are done with fancy texture switching, which I talk more about in detail in the Morning Turnips commentary. So feel free to check that out if you're curious about how I do the face animation. It's also dumb. That's fine. My chair. Geometry nodes. What a great time. One of the things that I wanted to get a bit of a grasp on was Blender's new geometry nodes. One of its big goals with its initial implementation was to be used as a better scattering system than particles, which in my case would be great because there were a couple shots or instances where I needed to scatter a lot of objects. Shots like inside of Kevin's house where he's crafting all the clams and baits, the pile of bait on the beach, as well as the sea bass pile at the side. But I also wanted to use it to make the environments. So for both the piles and the forest, they both use the same general setup, which was just instancing geo and items across the surface. It was neat, and it was super useful for the piles because I could make a pile shape just out of like same geometry, and then just use the geometry node system to cover it in clams or bait or sea bass. And unlike with the hair system, if I changed the shape of the base pile shape, then the whole pile would recalculate and refill itself accordingly. So I wouldn't have to do any additional slider fiddling back in the hair or particle system kind of node to get it to work on a different sized object. And it was great, which helped a lot during the pile shrinking and growing shots because I could just scale the shape or the base pile shape, and then the pile would readjust itself. I want to keep learning it and doing stuff with it because Blender 2.93 added like a ton more improvements and features, but I can't upgrade because my project manager, Prism, isn't compatible with 93 yet, which makes me very, very sad. I'd also love to try and convert the grass systems that I've been using over from hair to geometry nodes, but I'm not sure how capable it is of doing like wind blowing effects or like grass interaction stuff. So if anybody has any resources on that, then send that my way. That'd be dope. But yeah, that's geometry nodes. I'm gonna be using a lot more to do scattering. That's what it's all. And in terms of how I use it for the environments, basically I just made at least for all the outdoor environments, I made a big square, like a big square plane. I subdivided it a ton and added some displacement modifications to it just for some different elevation and like little hills and stuff. And then I took my tree model, I took a bush model, and then I took all of my weeds, and then I just ran them through a geometry node scattering system that I had set up so that it would scatter it across the land. And this was nice because essentially for all the outdoor shots, I just took this square of forest and would just find interesting little cups or little holes of places where I could put the camera and Kevin and stuff, and just animated shots inside of that. And if I found later on that, like, oh, maybe the trees are looking weird, or the bushes are looking weird, or like something's getting in the way, then I could just go back into the geometry nodes and like change the seed or something, or add more nodes to like slide them around or edit them or what have you. And I made it was super easy. It was super duper, super simple, super fast, and it was great. We're using more of this, and it's a good time. It's a good. Next step, talking about water. I don't need it. I definitely don't need it. Water's always a struggle because I never want to do sophisticated simulations for it. Sims just take long to produce and iterate on and render, and I'm like, whenever I can, I always try to go with the procedural route. And if you guys remember from Inboxes, or the Inboxes director's commentary, where I mentioned struggling a lot with getting water to work the way that it did, there was a lot of dynamic paint problems, and there was a lot of some other constraint systems in place to get all the boats to kind of, you know, rock around on the water. If you wanted to see the whole drama debacle of that, check out the Inboxes director's commentary. But because I did all that over there and figured all of that, or at least figured out what doing that kind of effect entails, redoing it again for this video was significantly easier, or at least I felt a lot more comfortable tackling more water in this video because I had a better grasp on that, which I really needed since there was a whole sequence that took place by the ocean, and I was not excited for it. I'm not gonna lie. So I employed a couple different techniques. They're all not like phenomenal in quality, but they fit the aesthetic pretty well. So I wasn't trying to go for like hyper realistic. I was just trying to go for, you know, good and nice enough, and kind of in line with Animal Crossing. For most of the wide shots, it's just a big plane with like a wave modifier or like a displacement animation on it. And then for close-ups, it was a lot more like surgical water chunks that I have to figure out and play up to the camera. Like, for example, those close-up shots where we see the fish in the water, you know, being a fish, and there's ripples coming off of it, and sometimes the bobber. I had to make like a small yet polygonally dense square with like dynamic paints driving some wave modifiers to do that. The thing that sucked about this was that I couldn't render these shots with Pandora, which is the render manager that I use. So for all those close-up shots, I had to manually open the shots up, bake out or pre-bake the ripple animation, and then manually render it one at a time. And it was because for some reason the bake information just wouldn't load whenever the shot was reopened. I'd bake it, save it, open the shot again, and then it'd be gone, and I'd cry. So I needed to render those shots all manually, and that took like a day maybe. And then ran into another problem with the initial whale shot, which was the animated textures for the water kind of just randomly stopped or paused after a certain amount of frames, despite the noise pattern for it being animated for the shot's duration. So I had to like re-render the ending bit of the shot again to fix it, and they tried to blend it in together because I didn't want to re-render the whole shot from scratch because I didn't really need to. But then in the middle of that, Blender crashed. So then I had to go back and reopen the shot, rebake the ripple animation, and then re-render it again. But because the bake is now different, the ripple animation was a little bit different as well. So I couldn't just start from the frame that it ended on or that it crashed on and continue. I had to like render an extra little like buffer amount of frames so that I could blend into it. And then I did that. And then no, it didn't crash. It rendered through, but I ended up having to blend together 3 passes of the shot to make it look like one cohesive shot, and that was an adventure that took too much patience. For the shark bass shot, I did this dynamic paint thing that I expressed in Inboxes so that I could get this like wet sand looking effect, which I think came out significantly better here than it did here. Only problem was that when I was actually like initially setting this shot up, every time I tried to bake the wet map for it, Blender would just crash. I couldn't figure out the exact reason as to why, but it just had something to do with the beach geo that I had. So I ended up making like a custom little chunk specifically for the shot, just to do the effect on, like a little high-res version of just the beach from that angle. So and then it unwrapped it nicely, and then textured it all accordingly and what have you. And then it finally was able to bake, and I was able to actually set up the effects and everything like that. And yeah, I thought it came out really nice. But then later on, I remembered that what I did for this shot, I didn't do for this shot, and like I didn't necessarily forget. Like I made a note and told myself to do it, like I would do it, but at some point I just never did, and I'm like, it doesn't even matter, no one's gonna notice, it's fine. So I just kind of kept going, and I just left it. When it came to texturing isn't really my strong suit, like especially texturing good looking water. There's just something about it that I'm like, everybody else seems to get looking really nice, and I just can't replicate myself easily. But a kind chap on Discord, good old Fruit Juice, thank you very much, pointed me out towards this neat little material that somebody by the name of 3D Vision made. And that's what kind of drives a good array of water material shots, or water materials for most of the shots. I say mostly because I did end up requiring me to do some other subtle tweaking to make it look good in the cycles. And it was just coming out a little bit too diffuse and not watery enough. So I merged it with some other water material tutorials, and then gave it a nice half semi-realistic-ish, half cartoony kind of vibe, and then I thought it looked kind of neat. It came out better in some shots than others, I will admit, but for the most part, I was pretty pleased with it. It was also this shader that aided in the ripple effects as well, because it was that shader that added like foam and other ripple reflection effects and stuff like that you could see around the fishes. Yeah, it was a good time. I thought it was neato, and I was pleased at that. Fossil shot, or fossil sequence, I should say. Everyone's favorite, surprisingly. Like, you want to know something funny? I was actually super afraid of doing the sequence for two reasons. The first being that it's a first-person fossil perspective of being dug up out of a hole, put into a bag, and then put into Blather's hands. And I was like initially writing it out, going like, wow, this is a great idea. But then like when I actually finished storyboarding it and got to blocking, I'm like, how do I even do this? My second fear, which was if it ends up looking bad, then people are just gonna think it's gonna look cheesy, and I was really worried that I wouldn't be able to do it justice and it would look cheesy. But I think it came out pretty tasty, not gonna lie. The reference for it was the Life of a Bullet sequence from the Nicolas Cage film Lord of War, as some of you might have guessed. But those guys had a team of people who knew what they were doing on how to achieve such a sequence, whilst I, on the other hand, have no real idea of what I'm doing. And yeah, it was a lot of experimenting had to go into play here. It was not a good time. For most of the production, I just kind of ignored it and like didn't touch those shots for like as long as I could. Like I'd pop in here and there, like chip away at them in like some fashion, but it just kept like filling me with a lot of dread and like confusion every time I opened the shot up, because I'm like, I don't know how to make this complex-ish sequence flow nicely. Though I did make it a bit easier on myself a little bit by splitting up into 3 shots instead of like one long continuous shot. So the dig up, the place inside the bag, and the Blather's handoff, they all do a cut during the black screen wipes. Not necessarily, unnoticeable, but I just thought I should mention that. I actually started with the bag shot first because it was the simplest, believe it or not. Like the fossil just kind of plops in, everything shakes for a little bit, then everything gets the 3 of them get selected, and then it gets picked up or like flies out of the bag and then into black. So I ended up just doing all the tools with shared noise animation. Like I just made a block of noise and then I just applied it to all the tools. I added the glow stick both as a reference to inboxes and also as a motivation for the light source. With the selection, I knew I wanted to do the outline effect that the game has in the inventory, but wasn't exactly sure like what way to go about it. I was originally going to try to do it with like an animated solidify modifier, but that ended up just giving me troubles. Not really troubles. I didn't really pursue it. Like I tried it once and I'm like, nah, it looks kind of trash. I'll do something else. So I animated everything just in general without the effect. And then when it actually came to rendering, I'm like, okay, well, I know of this other technique, which is using the Fresnel node to make this like a highlighted mask looking effect. And a Fresnel, for anybody who doesn't know, or at least a Fresnel node, it basically just looks kind of like an inverted ambient occlusion pass. The parts of the mesh that are closer towards the camera are darker than the portions of the mesh that are further away. And this effect can be dialed using like a ramp or something, and then also be pumped into or pumped out as a mask. So I thought, oh shoot, I can just use this and make the outline, and then make like a strip, like a mask, like a strips thing, like color like how it is in the game, and then just use this as a mask, and then yeah, turn it on and off, and Bob literally becomes your uncle. Let him in. The fact that it glowed was actually a super happy accident. Like I did it, I hooked everything up, and like I animated it, and then when I hit render, it looked great, and I loved it, and I was like, cool. Then I accentuated it in post with some glare additives or whatever. The blather scene was a lot more fine than I thought. Both the blathers and the fossil were both animated independently of each other. I wanted his grubby hands to kind of like move all over the surface of it, and I knew if I parented the fossil to his hands, then it would make that action of them sliding around a lot more difficult to achieve. But that's not to say that it wasn't weird, because the fact that they aren't connected is kind of a bit obvious, especially at the end where he stops moving and then everything kind of just freezes in place. But it was a detail that I thought wasn't really worth fixing too much, so I just gave it like a little bit extra movement and then kind of just moved on, because what am I, ILM? No, I'm Dongle. Then when those two were good enough, we went back to the starting shot, and at this time I actually like wanted to like sit down and actually, you know, give it the proper attention that it needed to figure out how to actually do the shot. And it was super challenging. Fine-tuning how it comes out of the hole and like turns around and then drops and then gets pulled into the bag. Plus Kevin needing to like match all those motions and timings and whatnot. Like the shot needs to look like Kevin's the one influencing the camera, whereas in actuality, the camera is influencing Kevin. The camera needs to move in a way so that the viewer can read everything happening whilst everything happens in the shot. And that shot was originally supposed to be shorter, but when it actually came to animating it, I realized that a lot of the holds weren't being held long enough, and we were losing a lot of like time to read the scene. So I kept having to like go back and forth between changing the timing and then changing the poses for things, and then changing the timing, and then trying to refine the arcs and trajectories that everything went, and it was gnarly. It was pretty gnarly. And then there was the shovel, which was a huge pain in the butt, because I wanted to do this, have him holding an item that he changes his hand positions on while still being constrained to said item. And this problem came up throughout the entire video, a lot during the bugs, because the net would vanish and would free up his hands from his constraints. But in this dig up shot, he had to stab the ground, change positions to get better leverage, and then pull it up. I made a rig for like just the shovel, and had both of his hands constrained to it, and just animated the shovel doing all the actions throughout, which added a little bit of complications during the grab and swing, because I couldn't move the shovel or else his hands would move as well. And if I just animated their constraints turning on and off, then they'd fly off and offset in some other direction, and it wouldn't look nice, because then we get like smear frames where I'm trying to like fight their new unconstrained positions. And animators, how do you guys do that? Like animate a character picking up and holding items, and like just generally interacting with stuff. I'm like, I would just imagine there's like this arsenal of in-house proprietary tools that like let you guys do this kind of stuff in films like super easily, and Blender, at least in my experience, just has no nice way of doing it elegantly enough. But it could also just be the rig. Though sometime later, I did find a neat add-on called Dynamic Constraints, which makes doing these kind of like on or off constraint toggles a lot easier. But I wasn't aware of this until like way after I was done animating, so that was kind of sad. But I'll probably use it for next time. But yeah, that was basically the fossil sequence, I think. Lakitu. We only see him for like a really brief moment. He moves his head out from behind his camera, and waves, and that's it. But he's on screen long enough for the viewer to like be able to scrutinize his render quality. So that meant needing to actually have like a high enough quality model of him for him to do this, or for his cameo. When I was initially writing it, I did like a really quick Google search for his model. I confirmed that there was like a couple that I could choose from, and then I'm like, okay, sweet, we'll keep him in. But then when it actually came to like setting him up and getting him ready and stuff, that's where a good bit of problems kind of arose from. Firstly, I didn't just use like a single model from a single game. Either the model as a whole would be too low poly, or the textures would come out looking weird, or like one half of it would be kind of ugly. So instead I ended up going the Frankenstein route and mixing a couple different models together to get one nice looking model. The body was a nice higher quality model from the I think the Wii U version of Mario Kart 8, but it didn't come with a cloud. So I ended up just removing his legs because it came with his legs, and then hunting down for an adequate cloud model. I ended up trying a few. I think I looked at putting in 3 or so. Like one would either be too low quality, like polygon wise, or another one had a really nice model, but the textures for it were like pinching under his chin. Couldn't solve that easily. But I ended up coming across another one. I think it was the Lakitu model from Mario Party, I think 9, which had a terrible looking Lakitu, but really nice looking cloud. So I ended up stealing that and just putting them together. With all the models that I found, all the cameras weren't good enough, or weren't high quality enough to like hold up with the rest of his model. So I ended up just modeling a little camera based off of this image and textured it and materialized it or whatever accordingly. But the rigging aspect of it was kind of funny because he's only rigged to a point where he can bring his hand up and wave. I did rig the fingers with the intent of like bending them just a little bit, but they didn't end up skinning properly, and I didn't notice until like I actually like got into the shot and started animating him. They just don't deform correctly at all. So I just didn't bend his fingers, or at least on his left hand at all. His right hand kind of, but it was gross. Don't look at it. It's a bad time. His hands are stiff. And yeah, that was kind of him. Interesting cameo, because I thought it'd be funny if like, well, actually the reason why I put him in to begin with was I came up with the idea of the first person fossil first. And I thought it would be really funny, since Kevin is pulling the fossil out of the ground, pointing it towards the camera as your character would do in game. What would the fossil see? And it was either going to be nothing, like with some awkward silence, holding it up to just the sky. But then at some point I'm like, oh, what if it was this character from other Mario games, because he's the camera guy in other Mario games. That's kind of fun. Let's just put him in, I guess, and then just make it a big thing. Make it a big nice little thing to do with Lakitu and boy turtle. And yeah, and I think it was a nice surprise. There isn't really a lot to say about like the general sound design. I collect most of my sounds from either the game files, more on that I think a little bit later, or from the website Epidemic Sounds. It was kind of funny because when I got into the audio portion of this video, I thought it was going to be like a breeze, like I'd have it done in like a day for some reason. But then I came back down to earth fairly quickly, realizing that it would not take a day, but in fact several. And there was a bunch of really small, big things that I was overlooking the entire time. The speech and sound for the dialogue, sourcing in-game sound effects, figuring out what the fossil sequence was going to sound like, picking, making, and editing the music, and then just the passive mirroring it all together nicely. So we'll start with speech. The speech was a really interesting problem. The first thing I tried doing was what I did back in Morning Turnips, which was finding recordings of character speech and splicing together good enough takes. Like I got recordings of Isabella, Tommy, Blathers talking and tried cutting it together. But the problem with that is the fact that you need to battle with the background audio the entire time. If you don't have audio that's quiet enough, it would constantly conflict with the video's actual background audio. and would just constantly be a distraction. And that's precisely why I didn't do any speaking or dialogue for In Boxes. During the entire production, I knew that splicing wasn't really going to work or be good enough, and I needed to find a better solution because this video and future videos are only going to rely more heavily on dialogue because Animal Crossing is a game about dialogue. Which brought me on to option 2, which was modding. Me and a buddy of mine legit tried to mod a version of the game to remove all the background music and all the environmental audio so that I could record animalish, like cleanly, I guess, from characters. But literally almost immediately into it, we were met with A, I don't really know what I'm doing, none of this is really working, and a lot of it's just flying right over my head, and B, this would require me to need to like speed run the game to unlock and get to specific characters just to talk to them, and I didn't want to have to delay the video just so that I could play Animal Crossing. So scratch that out. So this third option kind of had to work, because everything else I was finding wasn't really good enough, and that last option was figuring out a way to replicate or recreate the speech myself. And boy oh boy, was that a rabbit hole. So, at some point during my file acquiring escapade, I came across a lad that exported all of the dialogue sound bits for the characters. There's literally hundreds of them, and they're all broken up into 4 specific categories, which in general have a couple different voice profiles within each. So I'm like, okay, cool, that's a step in the right direction. I have the core files, and I know the game just kind of shuffles these around, so how hard could it be for me to do the same? So I crack open my audio editor of choice, which is Cubase, and I try to do the first obvious thing, which is literally just taking the files and sequencing them by hand in my timeline. But that ended up sounding terrible and took forever, so I needed something that was a lot faster to work with and a lot easier to set up. So I thought, okay, well, what if we just assigned them to a bunch of keys and started playing them randomly? And that kind of sparked the next idea. Now, as far as I could find, Cubase didn't actually have a built-in way to just assign a number of samples to a keyboard or keys on a keyboard. So I used the next best thing, which was a drum sequencer. So then I downloaded Groove Agent, which comes free with Cubase, but then soon realized that that wasn't really practical because it limits me to 16 samples. And this free version also didn't come with an ability to have a sample play and stop once the trigger is released. So if I played a lot of them in sequence, then it just ended up sounding like overlapping noise. And that wasn't usable. So then I tried another sampler called Serato Sample, which was like Groove Agent but lets me use a ton more samples and also gave me release controls. But it also wasn't a good solution because it would require me to have to make, export, and then manually re-import strings of sound bites to then recut up inside of the plugin. And it did work to a degree, but it wasn't really elegant enough to replicate for other characters. And I honestly thought this was the best way to do it and was gonna go with it. But then I did a little bit more Googling and realized that Contact, a sampler plugin that I use that powers some 90% of the instruments in my music, is literally designed to do what I'm asking. So I scream. I open it up and watch a tutorial or two on, how to use it in that way, because I never had before in the past. And it could. Bam! Every key has the sample on it, and I could do this. And then I could program like a chunk of random notes just being played randomly, add a bunch of pitch bending, and we get something that sounds really close, in my opinion. It's still a little bit robotic sounding, but it's clean and I can make it performative. I think it's good enough, which was everything I was asking for, and with that I could export it. Mash it up a little bit in Resolve with some pitch bending, and I have dialogue. And what's awesome about this is that I can just make a couple different loops and reuse them with pitch bending. Like, did you know that Tommy and Blathers are both gentle boy, but Timmy is pitched 4 semitones higher? Or that Sahara is technically a sassy sister? Yeah, I didn't. And now you do. And now we can both suffer together. I'm realizing after the fact that audio engineers watching this might have better solutions to this. If you do know of a better way to do this, then I'm all ears. Lay it in the comments or whatever. But do with that what you will. That's how I got that working. And now I'm like just a little bit more confident about doing more dialogue in the future because I have a system that I can actually rely on instead of having to spit shine the alternatives. It still requires a bit of labor. Like in Resolve, I can't do animated pitch bending on a per clip basis, which sucks a lot, but doing it manually is still fine, so we dance. Back in the Inbox's commentary video, I expressed this frustration that I had. I needed to source a lot of the game sounds and sound effects for these videos to stay kind of true to the source. I usually try to use the game sounds wherever I can, but that involved having to do this like really time-consuming step of manually extracting hex code information from the files in hopes of finding the sounds that I was looking for. It was very time-consuming and very painful, and I expressed that in the video. But then Pip brought 01 comes out of nowhere and is all like, "Yo, bruh, just saw your video. Good stuff. But this whole thing, yeah, you can automate it." And I'm all, "What? Nah, I'm just left to suffer forever." And he says, "Nah, like just look up bars to B wave, fam." And I said, "Oh my goodness, Pip, I've had it up to here with you making me look like a fool, all right?" Followed by a picture of like a very low bar. And this guy had the audacity to come back and say, "Doongie, you are putting words into my mouth." In fact, this whole dialogue didn't even actually exist. I just posted a nice comment and you feel like a buffoon because it actually worked. And now you're taking this non-malicious, hopefully lighthearted seeming frustration out on this completely fictitious text exchange. And I said, "Yeah, you're right. I'm sorry, Pip. You're actually really great, and I actually wouldn't have tried it if you didn't post that comment. So thank you." The reason why I didn't really pursue it much was because there's a lot of command line work that you have to kind of figure out. Most of the time I just don't have the time to sit down and troubleshoot that kind of stuff. But the fact that this worked was great. And now all the game sounds are converted into B-waves, which is a file format that I can a lot more easily kind of sift through and find things in. Like, it still took me like 2 days to find all the appropriate sounds for like the fish bobber or the net swing or what have you, but now I have the sounds that I can find stuff a little easier. And that's it. That's all I want to mention. Thank you for listening to my TED Talk. Specifically talking about the fossil sequence again, sound-wise at least, because this was the sequence that surprisingly got the most attention. So the goal of the sequence was to make it sound as if all of the sound was coming through like some cheap GoPro mics. So all the sound was filtered to just have no low end, except for things hitting the mic, like the rock hitting the lens, for example, here. At the beginning of the shot, we also have an audio gag of Kevin spawning his shovel and it immediately breaking before spawning another one. I never did audio gags before, so I thought it'd be fun to put one here. I also wanted to have the sound of hands or things rubbing against the camera's microphone the entire time, like high frequency sliding sounds, for example. Most of the sequence I just recorded myself. Like, I just took my mic and like caressed it a lot or hit it to get some of those like peaking mic sound effects. To get the inside of the bag sounds, it's not that funny, but it makes me laugh. I have a box that's just filled with like computer related junk beside me. It's got cables and USBs and like desk knickknacks and what have you. Like, you know, those the things that might come in handy box that you just kind of like dump everything into. I was looking at the clip and thinking, well, I need the sound of a bunch of stuff rustling and hitting the mic in a bag. So why not just put my mic in that box and just record what it sounds like if I shake it. And yeah, that's how I got that sound. That's how I got that sound. And I just took out the low end and that was it. That sound recording was also used for the rustling in the cabinet in Tommy's shop at the beginning as well. Fun fact, I was also really on the fence about adding music. I worried it was going to feel really boring just hearing sound effects, but I also didn't have any ideas of any fitting music that wouldn't be distracting, so I just ended up not adding any since the museum music would have faded in anyways, so there wouldn't have been enough time to introduce a song and have it fade out. And I'm actually glad I didn't do that, because I think the scene would have suffered if I did, to be honest. Speaking of music though, I originally wanted to make a custom song for the bug catching montage, but I ended up not wanting to spend too much time making music since I had already been working on the video for quite some time at that point. So I just opted to pick a lively upbeat tune from New Leaf, and it ended up working surprisingly well. Same with the fishing tournament song. Like, I put it into test and it ended up kind of working right out of the gate, so I just rolled with it. But then there was that little time lapse with the fish piles. I wanted to convey like a feeling of a little disappointment and frustration, and that song was a bit too uplifting for that. And I couldn't really find a nice replacement for that. And then in some offshoot idea, I was like, well, usually when I want to make a situation feel uncomfortable, I'll just pitch bend the music. So I tried it, and I ended up laughing a lot and was like, okay, this idea will work. So I cut together a really rough version of it, where on every shot fade, it would just go down a semitone or two, but I couldn't really have the song continue throughout the rest of the sequence because it just sounded weird to play for longer than that little montage time. So I'm like, the song needs to end here. And then I realized that there was a nice loop point, but the sequence was kind of like just not long enough to reach it. So I ended up slowing down the second last shot just in post, and then doing a hard cut with the last shot, and then letting no music play from that point onward. And I thought that ended up working pretty well. I'm still kind of bummed I couldn't like work in some other jingle or tune during the sunset area of it, but I think it was fine. But that rough cut version still sounded weird because the pitch bending wasn't smooth, or as of Resolve like 17 or something, they removed the ability to keyframe pitch bending on a per clip basis. So I cracked open Cubase again and just figured out how to do some modulated pitch bending stuff in there, and we got to do the same thing. And learning this here helped a good bit, because it was also roughly around this time when I made that like string stinger thing or whatever for the big red shot of Kevin. Like, it's just sustained notes pitched downwards, but I didn't know pitch bending before I did it, and then I did it, and then I was like, oh cool, I can do that. And then yeah, I also made that like little dramatic crafting song as well. But the entire time, and still kind of now, it feels a little bit overkill for the mood, but the scene feels a lot more dead if there's no music. And that was basically all the music for the sequence. There was also the red theme, but that's just the red theme with some reverb on it. Nothing too crazy. It probably sounds like me explaining this makes it seem like all this was like planned, but I assure you it was. A lot of this wasn't. Almost every solution to anything was kind of figured out on the fly, or just conveniently fell into place literally within the 3 days that I gave myself to do audio. And I'm very thankful for that. I think it came together pretty well, at least auditorily. All right. So that about wraps up everything that I wanted to talk about, or at least I think I want to talk about. My apologies for not going into detail about a lot of things. I'm very wordy when it comes to explaining things, as you've seen in the video, which usually results in me needing to edit like a lot of visuals to go along with it, and I just didn't really want to do a lot of that this time around. But you're always free to ask questions in the comments, and I'll get back to those in better, well-structured responses. I guess I could talk about some things that I'm excited about. I'm excited to try updated versions of Blender. I'm figuring out some different pipeline kind of systems so that which would unrestrict you from upgrading Blender. I also picked up Substance Painter and Substance Designer so that I can try learning those to help with the texture quality problem, because as I make these videos, it becomes very apparent that the game's textures, like the resolution of the textures that I'm using, are just not up to snuff with how I'm rendering them and how they need to be seen. So I'm going to attempt to add in some new tools to help make things look a little nicer. What else is there? I also was probably going to warn you guys that this might be the last long-form edited commentary. Well, it probably won't be the last, but these take a lot of time to make, both to write them out, to record them, to edit them together and stuff. And it's a lot. And all this time is time that I can be using to, make the next short, which I think I prefer. So I think the next time I'm going to be doing a live stream commentary, and then in there you can, which I think should hopefully be better, because then you can ask me questions kind of on the fly, and I can show you guys stuff just like right then and there without having to go back and re-record things and be funny and all that stuff. Yeah, so the next one's going to be a live stream, but this won't be the last like long form video, I guess, here, most likely. Because people still seem to like them, so I don't want to retire them entirely. And I think that's everything. Thank you so much for watching. If you actually got this far, this is like the length of a documentary for a 5-minute video, which is always funny to me to get to the end of. But I hope you learned something. I hope it was entertaining. I hope it was enjoyable and educational to some degree. If you like what I'm doing and you want to support the channel, feel free to join the Patreon and get your name up in this list here, or the YouTube membership program. And yeah, thanks for being you. Thanks for being around. Thanks for watching. And I hope you have yourself a great rest of your day. Take care.